Great. Okay, so I can see that it's 1:02, and like every good teacher, I'm gonna try to hold us accountable to that. So good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Rethinking Performance Evaluation. I'm Carly Norton. I am your host. I'm also the Director of Marketing at KickUp, which is a company working with school districts nationally to power their professional growth cycles. So before we jump in, I want to first thank you guys. For those of you who are able to join us in the midst of the coronavirus epidemic, we know there are a wide range of districts and organizations that signed up for and are joining our call today. We know that many of you are facing some very real, daunting, and important challenges within your districts, from supporting the sudden shift to virtual or at-home learning, to ensuring that kids have ready and steady access to lunch and food during this really uncertain time. So we appreciate the time that you're giving us today to really talk about performance evaluation, because we know that it's such a precious resource right now. But in terms of our topic today, what really brings us here and what motivated this conversation was really that, as a team of educators, many of whom are former teachers, a lot of us have experienced firsthand the wide range of teacher evaluation processes. It's easy to see that the shift in professional learning to be sustained, personalized, and job embedded begs the natural question of how can our growth cycles really connect that learning and that support to the evaluation process that has for so long really been compliance-based. And so how do we really build that internal trust that's essential to its effectiveness in a time where evaluation has also often been made high stakes? So really big questions. And my slide. Really big questions, but when we thought about them, I think the key to the way that we approach education issues here at KickUp is really a district first perspective. And so thinking about one of our partners here who's on the call, Camdenton, Doug and Ryan Neal, who are going to talk to us about the way that they're really approaching performance evaluation and the practical side of how they're implementing it within their district. So we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking through this real life example of performance evaluation, but specifically we're going to make sure that we focus on the processes behind the district's evaluation system, so that we are identifying these key elements to make it an effective, scalable process. We're going to talk through some tips for designing professional growth cycles that connect our support with our evaluation. And then a big question in everyone's minds, how to build educator trust around the evaluation process. So to give you an overview of our time, we're going to do some brief introductions. We know that context is important, so we're going to hear from Ryan and Doug about their district. Then we're going to jump right into really what they're doing and what they've been doing for the past year and 2 years of teacher evaluation. Then we're going to spend some time with a Q&A. And even though you can see that it's on this agenda as kind of its own separate bullet, I really, really encourage you to drop in questions as we're going through. Even if we don't address them right as you submit, I promise we'll come back to them in the Q&A. But really would love to break that webinar stereotype and get some audience questions. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with a few takeaways and a resource as a thank you for spending this hour with us. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I want to jump right in to acknowledging the real stars of today. Dr. Neal, it looks like I have your image on here first, so that gives you the honor of being the first to tell us a little bit about your role at Camdenton and what you oversee.
Thank you. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Schools here, and I oversee curriculum and instruction, but I also oversee human resources. And then on top of that, I oversee technology, where I partner with Doug. Doug's the director of our technology program. So those are the three things that I do in our district with roughly 4,200 students and about 365 certified teachers.
Great.
I'm Doug Starkey. I'm the Director of Technology and STEM Education. I'm in charge of our IT, all of our networks and servers, as well as STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. We do Project Lead the Way and a lot of other STEM programs. So that's my role.
And Doug, I think one thing that I found really interesting is that you have such a piece of performance evaluation, which is not typically, what we see under the Director of Technology. So I'm curious, just in terms of context, like how do you think about your role in relation to evaluation?
Well, we support most of the district software. So, kind of the history behind it is they came to us and said, we'd like for you guys to create a evaluation system, which was a very daunting task when you look at the resources that were available. So that's when we met people from KickUp and started talking to them and talking about how we could make a customized system for us. And that's kind of how it started. So I've been supporting it and, helping Dr. Neal with it since that time.
The other thing that really got Doug involved in the process was that we hired Doug for this position from the classroom, but prior to Doug being a teacher, he was an engineer. And as an instructor, he taught for us for, I think it was 12 years. And as an instructor, he was an extremely good teacher and knew exactly what good teaching was. And so that made him a pretty natural partner in the development of something like this.
That's great. So I want to jump into the context of Camdenton. So now that we know a little bit about what your role it oversees within Camdenton, maybe Dr. Neal, you could tell us just a little bit about your student demographics.
Absolutely. We are kind of a vacation community / retirement community, and we're trying to kind of change from that to be definitely want to maintain those two things, but we also want to be new and innovative as well. We have a very large school district by boundary because our lake sits in the middle of it. We have about 42 to 4,400 students. We have about 650 employees, but again, about 360 of those are certified teachers. Right now, we're operating on about a $54 million budget. And what makes that budget unique in Missouri is that the largest portion of it, about 75% of that budget, is locally funded. That means that money comes on the backs of our local taxpayers through whether that be local income tax, but mostly real estate tax. We also, for being a resort type area and a lake area, we also have a very high free and reduced lunch count, and that number will continue to grow here, but it's also something that's not uncommon to our region, and that's approaching 60% at this time.
And so kind of keeping in terms of context, Dr. Yella, I know that I alluded to this a little bit a minute ago, but maybe you could tell me, within Camdenton and more broadly about the state of teacher evaluation, when you started rethinking your own process.
Thank you. Our state did a really interesting thing a few years ago, in 2009, I believe. They kind of pulled us out of a good old-fashioned 4-block rubric where everybody got a check mark if they were doing good, and they moved you right on down the line to something that was a little bit, allowed us to permeate the classrooms a little bit more and go in and see what was going on. Our school district took that a step up. We actually learned from the Gates Foundation and various other places that the traditional teacher evaluation systems don't really affect instruction. They don't really improve teachers in a traditional sense. So we kind of wanted to shift that narrative from a narrative of, well, good or bad teaching, or is giving a teacher a slap on the hand or something like that, and just shift that narrative to learning. How can we tell if students are learning? Our principals have been charged with the task of doing 5 walkthrough evaluations or walkthrough supervisions a day. Those things then being tied to not necessarily what is a teacher doing wrong or a gotcha, but instead we walk in those classrooms and actually kind of ignore the teacher. We walk in the classroom and we look for a student artifact, and we look for a lesson plan, and we look for a standard. And if those three things triangulate, we feel like we might have rigor in that case. We know that if we can then tailor or structure our evaluation system centered on learning, it becomes a lot less of a pain point between teachers and administrators, and more a focal point on how can we deliver standards for student comprehension. And so that's kind of, we kind of shifted from that old rubric of, I like this guy, he comes to work every day, I'm going to give him a 4, to some very specific things, which KickUp helped us immensely with. And so we could dive down granularly into that teaching and then provide feedback that we felt would help teachers.
Yeah. And it sounds like, there's kind of two pieces of that, of both thinking critically about the look fors and being clear and transparent about what they are, but also building the expectation that observation is the data is being used in a way that's focused on support as opposed to just completing that rubric, as you put it.
I think that's right, Carly, because, and forgive me if I ramble, but I just, in theory, it oftentimes seems that evaluation is awfully or frequently tied to employment. And you can go from school to school and ask any administrator, how often is a teacher actually removed based on or not renewed based on evaluation? It's usually almost 100% of the time something else, and what that something else is usually an event. What we were saying is, forget that. Let's take that out of the equation and let's start talking about student learning. We have some teachers that are better at helping students learn, and we have other teachers that aren't there yet. But if we had a tool that could communicate where they are and where we want them to be, now we've got a real chance to make some improvement. And it's lowered the stress level on an evaluation, actually. We've done a lot of research with KickUp on that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it brings up, I know that we had pulled this similar to something that you had said before about this idea that, we're coming into teacher classrooms a lot more than we used to. But how do we really take that and pair that with the mentoring and the coaching and the pairing, as opposed to pairing it with this high stakes decision about employment?
Yeah, we really like to keep those two things as separate as possible. Now that there's never going to be a time when we just permit poor teaching, but so many times a teacher plans and prepares and goes in and delivers, and it's not good. To me, that's on us. That's where we need to reach out and show some support and provide feedback that helps that teacher inch toward improving student outcomes.
Yeah. And so I guess in thinking about it kind of from this system perspective, when we're talking about the future of performance evaluation, we're talking about, really what you just addressed is making professional growth truly focused on that continuous improvement, but at an individual level.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so one of the pieces that I pulled really is a great resource, comes from the National Comprehensive Center for Teacher Quality. And they propose 6 basic but foundational components for an aligned teacher evaluation and professional development system. And so you can kind of see them listed here, but it includes teaching standards and professional learning standards. So these high quality standards that are really clear on what effective teaching and professional learning looks like. It is paired with training on those standards and tools, trained people to evaluate and provide feedback. So people within the process, like Doug and Ryan and their teams, really able to support. And then the two that we're really going to focus in on today, both the professional growth opportunities that are paired to these standards, and then multiple measures of teacher performance. And so a key part of this is that it's carried across the educator's career, beginning from recruitment and preparation, but it's extending through to support and evaluation. And so when we think about that piece, as a data company, and I think in our conversations with you, Doug and Ryan, we were thinking a lot about that the lifeblood really of these professional growth cycles is this ongoing and formative data, and that has to reflect teacher or student practice towards that set of high quality standards. And the promise of having that well-aligned system that has that data allows you to really form the basis for your professional growth plans. It gives the structure and consistency to your coaches and your mentors because it provides a shared expectations and common language. It provides a diagnostic approach, so you can determine what standards are being met. And it offers a set of criteria with practical measures that help principals, consulting teachers, mentors identify the areas in which teachers are successful and where they need to improve. And so that's kind of a long-winded way of walking you through just some of the higher level research behind this piece. But really what we want to focus on is what you guys are, how you guys are interpreting that research and applying it into Camdenton. So Doug, I'm wondering if you could tell me just a little bit about the tools and the checkpoints that Camdenton is using to really get that formative data underpinning your system.
Yeah, Dr. Neal alluded to some of these earlier, but probably the best tool we have is a support tool for teachers. It's primarily not evaluative. These are our walkthroughs. The main purpose of our walkthroughs is to communicate to teachers what the priorities are in their classroom, to communicate with them what is important and what administrators are looking for. And it's also, another purpose of it is to identify areas of improvement for teachers. And again, the frequency of those walkthroughs and the idea that teachers know that principals are in there for support and to give them what they need to be successful contributes to trust, which is what you alluded to earlier, because teachers get to the point where, oh, the principal's in my room, no big deal, I'm just going to go and do what I do, rather than, oh, I've got to really knock it out of the park because he's evaluating me. It's really a support. And so as a result of those walkthroughs and identifying areas of growth for teachers, we link that directly to professional growth plans. Professional growth plans is where teachers can look at the feedback and say, okay, I've got a couple areas that I really need growth opportunity here. And so they can identify those, and then principals support them in that through linking that to professional development and lots of resources that we have available in the district. So again, teachers take that feedback and that contributes directly to that professional growth plan. Professional growth plan is also linked to our evaluation system for formative and summative evaluations. Our formative evaluations are based on a modified Danielson model, a set of domains that teachers are evaluated on. So their professional growth plans are based on that feedback from the walkthroughs, as well as linking to those formal evaluation domains. So again, we have a couple professional development days in the district that are specifically for that, where our teachers come in, we have other people come in and really have that professional growth that teachers want that links directly to their professional growth plans that allow them to be successful in their evaluations.
That's great. And so what, when you're doing the observations and walkthroughs, how is that feedback shared with the teachers? And I guess who is that feedback shared with?
Through KickUp, teachers get a copy of the walkthrough and all the principal comments. And then of course, if they have any questions or if they need to talk to their principal about something, then they'll typically set up a meeting with them. But that's primarily how the feedback occurs is through KickUp and that email feedback.
And so when you're thinking about the professional growth plans, maybe you could talk just a little bit more about how teachers, like what supports you give to teachers to set their professional growth plans, and what kind of culture you have around those goals that they're setting within them.
Oh, those professional, so each one of those walkthroughs does provide a specific data set of feedback. And so what you can do is simply go into a teacher's profile and look under the different domains from the Danielson rubric and see where a teacher needs additional support. So it's really a data-driven situation where you can take a teacher and sit them down and draw up a growth plan. In other words, where's our baseline? Where are we starting in an area where we want to show growth? In the beginning of the year, we can go look at their previous year's kick-up data and say, it looks to me like you could use some support here. Let's set a goal for where you need to be by Christmas, so to speak. And then that drives that conversation for the next 3 or 4 months between that building administrator and that teacher, just based off of what we were able to glean from kick-up for our growth plan.
Yeah. And so how do you think in terms of, having all of these different data points from observations to growth plans, and I'm assuming that along the way they're doing their own reflection as well. How do you kind of pull all of those pieces together to give you the comprehensive picture, and who uses that comprehensive picture?
I think that the system is kind of designed to make it like a bite-sized piece. So you set that growth plan, and then those principals then try to do their walkthroughs and evaluate through the lens of what was set as a growth plan from the beginning of the year. Then how it's supported, I think, is the next part of what you were saying, Carly. And that comes from, we're actually pretty blessed to have some instructional coaches. These coaches are who we've deemed our teachers of teachers. And so when a principal goes in to do a walkthrough, he or she notices a deficiency or an area where we could really use some growth. He pairs that instructional coach with that teacher. They work through lessons. They may co-teach. They may do a variety of things. And then at some point they report back to the administrator and say, hey, I think we're ready for you to come back and take a peek at this. I think we've shown some growth here. And so then that principal would be able to come back in and see where they are and see if growth took place.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you also said a really critical piece there, which is that not only are they getting the feedback, but they're also, after they're getting that feedback, they're getting a direct connection to support when it's valuable and in a very job embedded way.
Oh, yes. Much more than just receiving a rubric with a check mark in it.
Yeah, right. What are you supposed to do with that rubric, right? But you guys
Yeah.
are really connecting it to here's what we would suggest, or here's how we're going to continue to help you grow in that area.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. So I want to jump into an audience poll question because we love to gauge the people who are joining us on the call. And so what I want to pause here on is for those who are joining us, as you're thinking through linking teacher evaluation to support in your district, or taking that next step of making evaluation connect to this ongoing support, what are the biggest barriers that you're seeing in your district or your organization to making that change? And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to respond to this poll question. But I'm curious, Doug and Ryan, with this same question, when you were thinking about really connecting teacher evaluation and using these professional growth plans to kind of bridge that gap, what barriers were you facing in implementing that in Camdenton?
Well, I can speak as a former teacher, and I think sometimes it seemed like there was a disconnect between the professional development opportunities that we got and how that linked to what we needed in terms of what they see in our classrooms and how we're supported in terms of meeting our evaluation goals. So I think our biggest goal in developing this is there needs to be a very strong link between professional development, and our needs in terms of our evaluations and so on. What's interesting that we find, and using KickUp as a tool, is that when principals go in and identify professional development needs for teachers, and then we poll teachers to see what professional development they think they need, those almost match up 100%. So that, I always find that interesting, and it's been the case every year. So teachers know what they need, and if you ask them, they'll tell you, and it almost always lines up, at least in our district, with what principals are seeing in their classrooms.
We also initially had some this actually feeds to what Doug was just saying later on in the process, but initially there was insecurity from our teachers about having principals come in consistently, but there was also a lot of insecurity about with our administrative teams about what to look for. And so that took some book study, that took some calibration of what we needed and what we wanted to look for, and then some communication with teachers about how we really want to step back from evaluation, and we want to look more toward teaching and learning, student outcomes. How can we partner an administrator and a teacher toward those student outcomes? And man, did that ever just take a lot of the stress off the table. When you see that principal come into your room, your mindset could have shifted from, oh, what does he want? Or why is he in here again? To, oh goodness, I'm glad he's in here because I was getting ready, I need support with this.
Yeah. And I think that cues up also what I'm seeing in the poll results, which really, you gave me the perfect segue about communicating this transparent message to the educators, to principals, to people throughout the system, that professional growth is important, and we're committed on all levels, not just in evaluation, but more importantly in what you just said around the support and the growth that we're really trying to encourage within our teachers. And so I pulled this visual that I know we've used before in terms of how you think about where the pieces of this process fit together. But Doug, maybe you could describe how you talk about this with your educators, and like what each of these, the walkthroughs, the PGP, the formal evaluation, how you communicate that message around their link together.
Yeah, I think, at least in my mind, and how we communicate with teachers, is the highlight in this picture is kind of how the professional growth plan is really that bridge between what we see every day in the classroom, the non-evaluative piece in terms of what we how we communicate with teachers, what's important, and how we support them. That professional growth plan is the bridge between that and the successful formal evaluation, so the formative and the summative evaluation. So there's a couple goals here. The one goal is we want teachers to be successful in terms of the evaluations, because that lines up with our model of what we want to see, the modified Danielson model, what we want to see in the classroom. But it also helps support them in terms of how do they get there? How do we get them to be successful in the classroom, to be successful in terms of meeting those domain goals? And the professional growth plan really is that bridge. And it's also specific to the teacher. It's an individualized set of goals. And it also allows them to express what they need in terms of support. We have a mid-year check-in with those professional growth plans. So principals and teachers check in to see if they're meeting their goals. If not, that's another level of support. So the principal can have a meeting with the teacher who feels like they're not going to meet their goals. And so that gives us a chance to step in and give them some additional support, so that, the old phrase that it's not an autopsy at the end of what we could have done to help you meet the goal, and even though you didn't, to the point where it's like, okay, here we are in the middle of the year, what can we do to help you? So again, that PGP really is that support for teachers.
Yeah, and looking in this other way, I think this makes sense in terms of the goal setting, that you're thinking about the focus areas and their target scores within the PGP. The evidence you're looking for is both teacher growth and student growth, and those next steps are really around connecting to the recommended support. So how are we getting there? Perfect. So I have an example that we pulled as one of the pieces that came out of looking at this data, and maybe you guys could talk me through. I think this is Dr. Neal. You could talk me through what I'm seeing here.
Well, we have, Doug mentioned earlier, we have 2 professional development days a year, and we've kind of learned that our teachers learn best from one another. And we actually have 350 some odd, 360 some odd teachers. We have some local experts. We actually have some teachers that have presented on a national level and consistently do. So what we've learned is that if we do like a self-directed breakout session, we can have a professional development day with maybe 70 offerings over a course of 3 hours, and have our teachers teach each other. We take our feedback from like a grid like this, and we see what our teachers desire to learn about the most, and then we build our menu from that, and then we go in and have a professional development day based on what was observed in classrooms. Instead of just random professional development, we can look in here and say, oh, we see that we're lacking literacy in this area, or we see that this classroom management is a huge issue in this area. And then we can go tailor professional development to that, and then nudge those teachers to attend those particular sessions as well.
Yeah. And Doug, I think this speaks to your point earlier that being a teacher, sometimes you feel like the offerings aren't that relevant to you. So what I love here is that because you're collecting both their needs and their interests, you can really offer a comprehensive list of opportunities and different types of supports. How does that look in the day-to-day? How do you approach like the nitty-gritty of actually suggesting, or are you rostering them into specific strands that you think are relevant based on their PGPs?
We really want to be sensitive to this because it is a little bit emotional. What we've done is we've had our principals, we've encouraged our principals to suggest, like they'll get the menu items for the professional development before the teachers, and then they will meet with the teachers, or maybe in a simple walk by, maybe pop in on a teacher and say, hey, notice the session in the 10 o'clock block by so-and-so. I'd really like to see you in that, and kind of nudge them that way. I think that if you were to receive that as a teacher, I think you clearly know what that meant, and probably be willing to oblige on that.
Yeah, I think we're also looking for, our ultimate goal is more of a real-time effort, where if a principal's in a teacher's room for walkthroughs a lot and they see maybe an area for improvement, then at that time they can recommend either a video or some offsite professional development, or a specific something at an upcoming professional development day, so that's more of a real-time thing where that principals can do it right away, and then teachers can get that help as soon as they need it.
Yeah. And do you find with your instructional coaches, are they also, a part of supporting the professional learning, or do you find that their role, like how does their role play into that connection point too?
They're involved in the curriculum writing processes, and then that allows them to have probably a more intimate view of what we're expecting as far as an outcome from a standard. So then when a principal does have something to point out to a teacher, that coach is really in tune to what, maybe even more so than what the principal is, as to what the outcome should look like. So yeah, we pair them that way.
And they are a primary driver for the content of our PD days, for sure, because they work with teachers and principals in knowing what that need is.
Yeah, so like another data point.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. So if we're looking here at some of the reactions that came from the different PD strands, I think we also have a great visual here that shows the feedback after you kind of invested in making the PD more aligned to teacher interest. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about how you view this data and what it tells you about your process.
Doug mentioned that how closely that typically aligns with what the principal's expectation is and what the teacher's need is. Elaborate on that, Doug?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, our data shows that teachers really do know what they need if you compare it to what principals feel that they need. But what I like about this kind of feedback is it not only is feedback about the content of what we've offered, make sure that that aligns with their needs, but also it helps us evaluate the presenters, because we may think that someone is a really fantastic presenter, but we also look at this data to make sure that the quality of what we offer is maintained.
Yeah. And I think true, like this middle point here, if we take the two highest agree statuses, agree and strongly agree, we're seeing that quick math here, that 94% of respondents are agreeing or strongly agreeing that their experience was relevant to their professional goals, which I'm sure as the planner of said professional supports and the implementing team, you really want to see that alignment is happening, because it's the first step into investment.
Yeah, that's way better than it used to be. I mean, that's definitely a big improvement over what we have seen earlier. So I definitely think we're on the right track.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to back up just a tiny bit to go back to the systems perspective. We talked a little bit about the policies that feel that you've implemented in the way you've rolled out professional growth plans, but how do you kind of pull it all together in a system level so that it feels like a comprehensive approach? And Doug, maybe you could talk just about the way the pieces fit together briefly.
Yeah, I kind of like this graphic because it kind of separates the evaluative pieces from the support pieces. As we've said before, the walkthrough really is non-evaluative, and it really is a support mechanism that we can communicate with teachers what's important, and then also identify areas of improvement. And then once we've identified those areas, we say, okay, how can we come alongside them and offer them mentoring, coaching, professional learning in order to help them shore up those areas of need. And then the PGP really is a way to quantify that, right? So the PGP, they have a targeted goals that I line up with the domains from the evaluation model. And there's also a student data piece to that PGP as well. That's important to make sure that there have some student data growth goals in that. So again, that graphic kind of, separates the support mechanisms with the evaluation mechanisms, because on the left-hand side, you have the formative evaluation, on the right-hand side, you have summative. So those are both evaluative. But again, teachers feel comfortable and confident with those evaluation pieces because of the support mechanisms that's in the center there.
Yeah. And so looking at it from, a calendar level, because I think the nitty-gritty is often what people are on the line to hear. They're like, ooh, show me the template, right? We pulled this calendar just to kind of give a clearer view of how the cycle works. And maybe one of you could just walk us through these key points of data collection and check-in.
Yeah, the PGPs at the beginning of the year, we usually do that late August, early September. And a big part of that is kind of left over from last year. In other words, because it's earlier in the year, what's left over from last year in terms of areas of growth, student data, those kind of things, to put on the PGP as a goal for the upcoming year. So that really is a beginning of the year goal setting kind of mechanism. And then, depending on the number of formative reviews that we have, it varies by teacher and experience, but those are in the November to January timeframe. And so what I mentioned earlier comes up next, and that is really about mid-year after first semester, is that check-in on the PGP. We call it a mid-year PGP reflection. So teachers will look at that PGP and they'll say, okay, I am or I'm not meeting the goals of my PGP. And then we also ask them, what are the things that are helping you meet that goal? And then what are the things that are impeding you in terms of meeting that goal? So once teachers fill that out, we identify those teachers that say, hey, I may miss my PGP goal. So that kind of triggers kind of a semi-automatic semi-automatic meeting with the principal to discuss that, to make sure that the principal can step in with instructional coaches and make sure that those teachers have the proper, mentoring, coaching, professional development that they need to meet that end of year PGP goal. Then in the April-May timeframe is that summative evaluation. And that really is basically saying, did you meet your PGP goal or not? And again, you're looking at that student data piece to make sure that they did that. And it really is a, sorry, I apologize for that. It really is, the kind of the overall end to whether or not you met that PGP goal. And, that's a big discussion with the principal at that point too.
And for context, one question, when you're thinking about the PGP goals, what's a realistic goal that you would expect to see within for a teacher? Like how much growth are you typically targeting?
Well, if you're familiar with the rubric from Danielson, you can move quickly. There's some low-hanging fruit on there. So depending on ours specifically has 4 domains, and each domain has 7 categories. So I think you can see growth pretty rapidly. And I encourage people to be aggressive with their goal setting too.
And so typically people are writing their goals in context of like amount of growth that they would want, like change, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Great. And so I want to dig in just a tiny bit on those mid-year check-ins, which I think I think there's a lot of wealth of knowledge in that. One of the pieces I pulled here, Ryan, was some of the system level data from the mid-year check-ins. Maybe you could talk about just what we're seeing here and then how you use this.
Well, I think that 70% of people feeling confident so far it speaks to the system that you've shown us earlier, that you from earlier slides of where we've set a goal together. You've been in my room and you've seen where I am. You've offered support from the instructional coach. I know we have professional development coming up, and all of these things make me feel 70% of us. That's a huge room. Feel like I'm on track to do this. Then another 26% say that I've improved. I'm not there. I don't think I'm there, but I know what to do. I know where to get the support from that. And then obviously you're going to get people that are already terrific and perfect, and then people that are quitting. So when you look at it that way, the 70 plus the 26, I mean, that's what you want to see. That's I guess we could use the word efficacy. Like we feel confident that we know what we're supposed to be doing and we know how to get it done. And so PGP kind of guides that thinking. This would be a good guide to a teacher's efficacy. Yeah. And that 2% would be absolutely terrifying. 6 teachers, so however many kids, their teacher's not confident they can deliver that. So might want to look at those guys and see what we can do to nudge them up into those other categories.
Yeah. So is that where you focus most of your efforts when you see this, is thinking about, the 6 and 7, 13 certainly feels like a reasonable number that we can focus in deeply. Or are you thinking about, how do you think about those 72 that are, feeling not yet on track, but they see next steps?
That would be my focus area right there. That would be the biggest effect to me. I may have exactly the same opinion as the 70% of the people, and some of them I may not agree with, but that second group down, that to me, that's the group we need to try to move the most. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the 6 people, that's concerning. That's huge concern. But we also have some really immediate and drastic measures we can take there too. Having those instructional coaches on hand, if we see learning simply isn't taking place, we can do an all hands on deck approach.
Right.
go in and swoop in and be more prescriptive.
Yeah. And so maybe it's like that, you know, the higher need, the high resources are going to those higher need percentage, but the core focus of your team is around this 26%.
Yeah.
And I know we also have this that I just thought were great other pieces of data that you're collecting at the mid-year check-in. You know, specific factors that are driving your improvements and barriers that are holding up their growth. How do you use this data, or how did this have an impact on the way that you're planning for the year?
I think this is really great data for principals when they sit down, once we've identified those teachers that need this conference with the principal. I think this is really good for principals to really be able to target and focus in on, what they're doing right, and what is working for this teacher, and then basically what are the barriers. So rather than just, some general conversation, this really helps them focus on how to fix the problem, right? And, if you've identified, the things that are most important, maybe that can be used, in a little better way or more efficiently or even more of it to try to help them meet their goals.
Yeah, that's great. And then we also have some end results. So this is from the end of year assessment. And other than I hope, giving yourselves and your team like a big pat on your back, how did you take this data, and what does this data tell you or inform your practice going forward?
Well, it fuels us. I can go back and say, we said that these things aren't necessarily stuff that we would want to use to determine employment or not. Instead, we have a data set from this that you can see where we know exactly where every single teacher is. There's very few evaluation systems that would allow that. Like, we could pinpoint where teachers are in their instructional process, where they are in their efficacy or in their tool set. And so this provides that for us, but it also shows us that we have people that still very much need our help. Our work is never done, and we can't give up on the 7% that haven't met their target. We've got to give them more support, and that's what gives us. Actually, we get pretty good reviews on that from our teachers because of the amount of support we give based on what we know.
And this specific data can also drive that beginning of the year PGP, because a lot of times at the beginning of the year you rely on data from the previous year. So if you had some PGP goals from the previous year that you did not meet your targets, then the hope is that, obviously we're going to provide more support for that, but we also want to make sure that goal continues the next year. So this is also good data in terms of creating those early in the year PGPs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I'd love to ask you more questions about your data, but I know that we're running up against 1:50. So I do want to make sure that we talk about, kind of the elephant in the room, which is educator trust. And I think that that's something that really concerns district leaders when they're thinking about how to tie or not to tie their professional learning with their evaluation system. And so I'm wondering, I think one of the biggest pieces really that we've talked about before is about communicating how the data is being used, because when you move to this kind of process, you're collecting so much more data. You may be in and out of classrooms more often. I'm curious, when you kind of made this approach and when you're talking about PGPs, how are you framing it to educators to build that trust?
I think that trust can start with simply that PGP meeting initially, where you're almost what we would call in a knee-to-knee conversation with your supervisor, and you're talking about the things that areas that you need to grow in, and then unpacking that list of things that our school district has to support that. I also think putting your money where your mouth is in the form of feedback. If a teacher's feeling threatened from feedback from a walkthrough, we've broken our system. Our system can't be a threatening system. This system, I mean, if we're truly in the business of encouraging growth, we learned a ton of this by reading a book called Leveraged Leadership. And it's an orange book. I can't remember who wrote it. But this book was, it came with a DVD, and it came with, so it's been a while back. It came with a DVD, and the DVD showed these knee-to-knee conversations. And they were what we'd call pragmatic. I mean, they were, hey, this is something that you can work on, don't you think? And this is how you can work on it, but never, if you don't do this, we are going to do this. We're never going to have that conversation. If we do, I would need to be present, because then we've shifted from focusing on teaching and learning to actually employment. And that's another one of the things in my wheelhouse that I would need to be a part of that conversation. But trust-wise, I mean, you could walk around to our 360 teachers and say, hey, do you know anybody that's ever been fired because of their kick-up data? The answer would be a resounding no. I mean, it would be.
Yeah. And I think too, you talked about like how you're using the data, keeping it in everyday conversation. So they're seeing, we're taking your feedback, we're rolling it out into pieces is such a critical part of the feedback loop, that a lot of times we get so excited about taking the data and changing the system that we forget about talking to the people in the system about the data as well.
Right. And that's the only way they can get better.
Yeah. So I know we're at 1:53. We have 7 minutes left together. I want to make sure that people on the call know that we have a nice little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit questions. I, of course, did not come unprepared, so I have quite a few questions that will take more than the 10 minutes. But if you're sitting here and you have something pressing you'd like to ask Doug or Ryan, please feel free to submit that. One question that I have for you guys is, I think sometimes when we talk about what really innovative districts are doing, there are a lot of district leaders who are sitting here and thinking like, this sounds great, but really daunting. And so it's, now it's this huge thing and I don't know where to start. So in terms of, you guys are so innovative and great, you can't even imagine what that feels like, I'm sure. But putting on your hat and pretending to be a leader who's just starting on this work, what's your advice? Like, what's a good first step?
Well, I can attest to that. As I say, it's been a couple years, but it was a really daunting looking task at that time. But again, once we partnered with KickUp early on, and they really worked with us in terms of customizing our system and gave us exactly what we want, totally responsive in terms of, well, can you tweak this here? Can you change that? Just completely at our beck and call in terms of changing things.
It was so awesome.
when you say that something needs to be added or whatever, and it's added that day, I mean you can really progress and continue to. I don't want to set too high expectations, but that's true. That's how it happened.
Oh man, yeah.
So again, having a partner like KickUp really allowed us to customize it, and it made the process so much easier when at first it looked really daunting.
Yeah, and also to say, and I've changed a lot in my leadership style over the last 13 years. I used to be kind of a crack the whip guy, and I'd crack the whip until maybe something would break even, and it wouldn't bother me because I knew where we needed to go. And what I've learned from that is a terrible leadership style, and and I've also learned that we don't have to get every single thing done in the first year. And if I had this process to do over, we rolled out 4 domains. I mean, we kept the line open and we rolled out 4 domains. And now, we're 5 years down the road, and this next year we're going to kind of roll back and focus on one activity or one domain at a time. If I were more then like I am now, I think we might have just done it one thing at a time. Your original question, where do you start? You have to just ask yourself, are you getting the results that you want from the process that you have? And if you are, don't do this, because it's a lot of work. But if you're not, you don't have to get it all done at once. You just need to get something. So, and I love the term low-hanging fruit. You need to get something that you can measure? What's something that you can measure that improves student outcomes, and start with that piece and then grow from there. Add a piece a year, add a piece every 2 years. But as long as you're moving in the right direction and you can measure that, that's what you need to do.
Yeah. And so I think what I'm hearing from that, if I can synthesize, is one is start small. So find something you can measure. I think that's a great nugget of, folding in these practical measures, these little pieces of measurement we can do just to kind of take a pulse on what support our teachers are needing. Two, I think, is being iterative. And that is such an important mindset to take, is like, just because we're putting out a framework and we're putting out a process doesn't mean we can't tweak it and make adjustments as we're going. And three, I think, is having a plan for how you're going to gather all that data and use it internally. And so if you're using KickUp, that's great. Obviously, I work at KickUp. I love having new partners. But if you're not working at KickUp right now, like, that's okay. There are lots of resources out there with scorecards and things that you can do as a first step while you're kind of getting ready for a more comprehensive shift. So, that's advice that is helpful, even if the reality is that you're just not quite there yet, but that's that first step you want to take. So I want to be, again, conscious of time. How many times can I say conscious of time without misspeaking? We will find out. And I want to jump to our last poll question while we have you here. And so we asked this question really because we are a company trying to have conversations that are of value to real district leaders. And so we just want to know what kind of topics are of interest for future conversations like this one. Please drop your question, your suggestions there. And then I also want to leave you richer than you came, with a resource that you can see on your screen here, kickup.co/PL index, and we'll also send this to you shortly. That is a quiz. So you take a quick quiz, few simple questions about your professional learning goals, and you're going to get a link to an interactive report that has all the results that we've compiled. So you can really compare your priorities to other districts nationally. So completely free, but it's a great resource as you're thinking in this planning process now about next year's PD. So you're going to receive an email from us with a copy of today's recording and an invitation to our next webinar, which is actually April, with our special guest, Jim Knight, talking about coaching cycles. Yeah, I think that's it for the housekeeping, but now that we've hit just the hour, I do want to take a second to say thank you again for all of the people who took some time out with us, and then a special thank you to Doug and Ryan. Again, we know how valuable your time is, so thank you so much for taking the time to tell us a little bit about how you're approaching evaluation at Camdenton.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Perfect. I hope you and everyone on the call have a great rest of your day, and you'll hear from us soon with resources.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.